in our world, in our lives. It has also leveraged existing scientific uncertainty. There are things we don't know about COVID. And uncertainty, it turns out, is a gateway to a number of different responses, and they can coexist. And let me just go through three of them. That's not the whole set, but an important set. Let me go through three consequences that we know from cognitive science are associated with uncertainty. Now, the first thing that uncertainty invariably does is to trigger conspiracy theories. Any frightening event that gives people a sense of having lost control will lead some people to engage in conspiratorial thought. Now, pandemics have been doing this since the Middle Ages. We know that whenever there is a pandemic, there will be an outbreak of conspiratorial thought, other forms of irrationality, anti-Semitism. All those things have been consequences of pandemics for hundreds of years. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, then my colleague John Cook and I have summarized a lot of the knowledge surrounding conspiracy theories in this handbook that is also available for download. So uncertainty gives us conspiracy theories. Uncertainty also provides an opportunity for political operatives and vested interests to exploit uncertainty as a reason to do nothing, a reason for inaction. In fact, this is so pervasive, the use of uncertainty to prevent action, that it has been labeled scientific certainty argumentation methods by the sociological literature, or scams for short. And we see this all the time in the context of asbestos, tobacco, climate change. Whenever vested interests are threatened by scientific finding, then the answer very often is, well, there is still uncertainty. And until we have proof of something, then we shouldn't act. And of course, proof is something you never get outside of mathematics. All you can have is evidence. And climate change is a wonderful example for this, because the appeal to uncertainty has been used for decades now to delay policy action, even though, in actual fact, uncertainty often should be interpreted in precisely the opposite way. Because I don't have time to get into the details of the mathematics of this, but we know for sure that uncertainty does not equal ignorance. Just because we're uncertain about certain things relating to COVID doesn't mean we know nothing. On the contrary, we know quite a lot about it. And we know enough to know, in many circumstances, that greater uncertainty should provide greater impetus for action. For example, in a pandemic, the less you know about the doubling rate, the more you should worry and the more you should respond, because if the doubling rate is faster than you think it is, it can have incredibly adverse consequences that require rapid action. So uncertainty should be sometimes an impetus for action. And now going back to the public and how the public responds to uncertainty and expertise, let me tell you a bit more about this survey from Germany earlier this year, where people were also asked two questions that related directly to uncertainty or controversy between scientists. And here are the results from these two items. There were others. It's a mixed picture, but I'm focusing on the ones I find most interesting. And here's one that says that controversies between scientists are helpful because they mean that ultimately the correct answer will prevail. Well, according to the survey, again, around 2/3 of the public actually agreed with that. They thought disagreement between scientists and battling it out is a good thing. And the public also recognized, at least half of the public, that most scientists who speak out about COVID are differentiating between things we know and other things that are still open questions. Now, again, that's not an isolated incident. There's other data that just came out by a British team who looked at the effects of communicating uncertainty on public trust. And I don't have time to get into the details, but their conclusion is that actually communicators can be more open about the limits of human knowledge because it does not undermine the public's trust necessarily. There are some exceptions to this, but by and large, the public is actually reasonably good if they're being given accurate information about uncertainty. So that's my thumbnail sketch of uncertainty and the psychological consequences it has. Now I want to take one more step because we're all stuck in the present now and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. No one does. But it would be interesting, I think, to know what it is that people expect for the future under the current level of uncertainty. So let me tell you in the last few minutes about a study that some colleagues and I have done in the US and the UK, and that is forthcoming at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future. And what we did in that experiment was to ask people what they would like to see in the future and what they thought they were going to see. So preferences versus expectations. And we gave them a couple of scenarios that were either progressive or back to normal. Those are just labels we put on them. The progressive scenario mentioned things like dealing with economic unfairness, climate change. You know, it was a sort of fairly green, progressive, forward-looking scenario. And the other two scenarios were about going back to normal. Let's not change anything. Let's just be safe, go back to normal. So, what do people want for the future? This is now in the UK, although the US looks remarkably similar, but because we're in Europe, I'll talk about the UK. Ignore the fact that there are two scenarios of each type. All I have time to talk about is the preference between back to normal and progressive. And what you can see here very clearly is that people, by a great extent, prefer a progressive future. If given the choice, they want to deal with economic inequality and climate change and so forth. But what do they think they're going to get? What do they expect the future is going to look like? Well, it flips around. People are, I guess, pessimistic in a sense. They think, oh yeah, we'll get more of the same, but not what I actually want. Now, that's interesting, and it opens up an avenue for interpretation of relying on something that is called pluralistic ignorance, which refers to the fact that there are sometimes situations when the majority of people think that they're in the minority. And we know when those situations arise, and I think we're in the middle of one with the pandemic right now. Let me give you one example to explain, again, with very recent data gathered from Germany, what I mean by pluralistic ignorance and how this wraps back to the infodemic we started out with. Now, this study found, based on interviews and surveys with 7,000 respondents in Germany, that making masks mandatory appears to be a fair and socially responsible solution. That was the conclusion, very clear conclusion of those researchers based on a very large survey. And the people who converge onto Berlin every so often to protest against the enslavement that arises from putting on a face mask and so on actually represent a tiny minority. In fact, today, just half an hour ago, I saw data suggesting that 90% of the public in Germany either find the lockdown measures and social distancing measures appropriate or want them to be tougher. It is only 10% who are objecting to those measures, a tiny minority. However, they're overreported in the media. They're the ones who go to demonstrations. They're the ones who get the attention when they engage in conspiracy theories. And so what happens is that the vast majority of people who do none of that, the vast majority of people who trust scientists and accept face masks and social distancing, are feeling that they're perhaps in the minority, and that hence the better future that everybody wants may not be what they're getting. And with that, I thank you, and I'll conclude my brief presentation.
Stephen, thank you very much for that. That's fascinating. It raised so many questions that I know that people want to start putting those forward very quickly. Can I just say, if you're putting questions into the chat, please do include your name and affiliation. It will make it so much easier for us to find you and to represent you in the discussion, and also help us to see who's commenting. So please do include that, and do start putting your questions forward, and we'll sift them as best we can as we get to the discussion. Stephen, that was absolutely brilliant. And I think looking forward, starting to see how this is taking shape in people's minds is incredibly useful. Obviously, there's a lot more to come, and we, in terms of the uncertainty. I think what it raises for us is to think about uncertainty very much in the social context of the discussion, rather than perhaps the other area that we could sort of drift into, which is the discussion about how we communicate the actual uncertainty. So we've had a lot of challenges throughout this crisis about things like communicating complex models, for example, something that policymakers have struggled with. They suddenly have to procure them, and they have to present them. And there are some areas there that I think some of our next panelists might want to raise as well. But I think what we've got here is thinking about how we handle this discussion. And certainly Stephen's come very, very strongly down in favour of the role of openness and transparency in doing that. And I think one thing I've heard you say before, but not in this presentation, I would love to kind of connect to that, is that if you don't own the uncertainty in the discussion, other people will own it for you. And that's obviously what's happening with the conspiracy theories. And we see that a lot of those trade in that uncertainty and outing it and so on. So I think the very positive message for openness there. So I'm going to move us shortly to a discussion with our panelists about this and to throw some more of those questions to them. And we'll go back to looking at those results from the Menti poll earlier in thinking about the shape of the challenge to kick us off. But first, I want to ask you another question, which is to think about, if you can look at your Menti now, what you think is the best action to improve public engagement during the pandemic. And please do draw on what you think you would have found more useful. I mean, sometimes we can get ourselves quite intellectually interested in the question of public engagement in science, but I think those of us who are also in an actual relationship of discussion find that sometimes it's surprising things that trip us up. So please do include anything that you've struggled with and that you think could be remedied. So please start adding your results to that Menti poll now. Okay. I'm going to just quickly turn to our best advisor on this, which is Cici. Cici, can you give me a thumbs up if we have to wait a little bit longer for these? Yeah, we wait a little bit longer to see these come in. I think what we'll do is we'll keep coming back to this. And there's a further question that you'll be asked, which is to look at what will change after the coronavirus crisis. Will it change? Will public engagement change? And that, I think, touches neatly on what Stephen just left us with, which is that question of what people expect to happen. So what do we expect to happen in the public debate? Let's have a look at that as well. So let's come back to those Menti questions in a little while, I think. Please do keep giving your responses. So we turn now then to our wonderful panel. Laura Smiley is a policy analyst at the European Commission, and I think for her, perhaps thinking about some of the nature of the discussion may well have changed. And I would love to hear from you, Laura. What has changed, do you think? What kind of issues have been coming up in your domain?
Of course. Thank you very much, Tracy. Thanks also to Professor Lindowski for a really interesting presentation to set the scene. I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone who's listening as well, to getting examples of what they find would have been more practically helpful. I'm heading up a programme called Enlightenment 2.0 at the European Commission's multi-annual research programme. And what we're wanting to do is find out ways where we can ensure the optimal uptake of evidence into the decision-making process. And so really, I have the privilege of working constantly between the science and the policy interface. And so really, I'm coming at today's discussion, looking at uncertainty about the specific challenges at that science policy interface, looking at, well, you know, where are we sort of struggling, and where are those points that we need to be noting and taking more action in the future, and what are the issues that we can be putting, or what are the actions that we can be putting in place in order to improve this for any future crisis, but also importantly to make the science policy ecosystem, if you like, to make it more robust and resilient for the future. So really, we've kind of identified about 5 COVID-19 specific sort of science policy interface challenges that we're really seeing as being quite crucial to this. So the first one, if you like, is really the need to integrate knowledge from different disciplines. Now, this is nothing new, but there's been a tremendous reliance upon the likes of, as you've previously mentioned, Tracy, the epidemiological modelers, for example, were very strongly looking to the natural sciences. But in the absence yet of a vaccination, of course, we're extraordinarily dependent upon the behavioural scientist community. Steve actually has got an amazing example of how the behavioural science community has actually come together to respond to part of this challenge that he might allude to later. But at the same time, we also need to understand at a broader societal level, you know, how people and public are generally responding, you know, to Steve's point on the pluralistic ignorance concept, which means we need to be bringing the social science together with the behavioural sciences, together with the natural sciences. Now, in the very best of times, we're not very good at that. Let's be quite realistic. And then if on top of that, we need to actually be synthesizing this to an extent that the results are actually meaningful to a policymaker, we are not there yet. And so this clearly calls for a significant increase in the importance that's attributed to the skills of knowledge brokerage. So that's the sort of first major challenge we're seeing. The other thing we're seeing, of course, is the challenge of knowledge overabundance. There was some phenomenal statistics that we saw that since April 2020, the quantity of COVID-19 articles in the academic databases has doubled every 14 days. Now that just provides an overwhelming amount of information to actually try and look at, well, how can we sort this? How do we know what's important from what's not important, what's of higher, what's of lower caliber? And that sort of is intrinsically linked, if you like, to the third challenge, which is really looking at, obviously during a crisis, this problem of time pressure together with quality control. You know, we're seeing an unprecedented number of PDFs floating around of pre-peer review versions of this really important article, etc. So how do we ensure that we uphold the incredibly important robustness of the scientific process, whilst at the same time ensuring that people have actually got access to what might be potentially very important new results, new analysis? What we're also seeing, though, of course, is then the challenge of sense making and allowing for contradictions and uncertainties in that scientific evidence. We've seen with certain the framing and how incredibly important framing is. We've seen different examples of science being positioned as having the one single truth and the one single answer. And equally, we've seen it as being, it's more of a journey that we're going on together, and one of discovery that will actually have contradictions. And so the framing of actually the science in the decision-making process is extremely important. And we've also seen that, that has been reflected in the way that scientists either have or have not actually been put in the front line with regards to media, etc. And then, of course, to a point that Steve raised, is where the fifth challenge we're seeing is really the struggle to be countering myths and disinformation, because this level of uncertainty is a trigger. It's a sensitive hotspot for potentially for malicious actors to want to intentionally attack, which goes to Steve's point on the conspiracy theories, but also for those without any malice whatsoever and who are just confused, partially due to the overabundance that I've previously mentioned, but also who are just not sure what to believe. So those really, from the science policy interface, are the 5 challenges that we are sort of clearly trying to overcome. As you know, the European Commission has been working on COVID-19 in a whole variety of different ways and has been putting through assisting in public health, but also travel and transportation, tourism, huge amount of investment with regards to research, innovation, as well as fighting disinformation, emergency support, etc., looking to the jobs, the economy. We're doing lots and lots of different areas. But with regards to public engagement directly, sadly, one of the initiatives that we had to postpone was actually the Conference on the Future of Europe. And so this, however, is not being postponed indefinitely. And so we're going to be going out to citizens to hear what they want their future to be looking like. It's just being postponed because we want to be ensuring that that's happening in the safest possible environment, whilst at the same time making the digital alternatives as robust as possible. So really, that is something that we're hoping will be coming out with during the German EU presidency. So watch this space for that.
Fantastic. Laura, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. One of the things it reminded me of was that Soumya Swaminathan, the chief scientist at the World Health Organization, just I think about 4 weeks ago, sort of was wringing her hands and just saying it's just such hard work going through all of these studies and actually working out what's of any good quality. And you can see the huge burden that's been placed. And one of the things that occurred to me when she said that, and you've just echoed it now, is right at that moment where you're convincing not just policymakers, but politicians of the need to consult the evidence. The evidence has suddenly mushroomed. And there's so much to guide people through. And I think that the research community and the publishing community and many databases and initiatives that have come up online have done they've certainly put an amazing effort into modernizing, making good interfaces, trying to look at ways to do synthesis quickly and all these things. Obviously, the task is huge, but I think it is kind of ironic that at that moment at which the very thing that shoves everybody towards, hey, actually, we need to understand something about the know-how of science. Now, right at the moment when it all looks immensely confusing and extraordinarily large. So I think that has been a really interesting challenge for the research community and publishers and others as well. Right, fantastic. Then we're moving on now to Imran Khan. And Imran, as I mentioned, is very aware of the volume issue in terms of what's being asked of researchers. And I'm sure that the Wellcome Trust has been experiencing that in terms of the disruption to normal activity among many of their major research projects around the world and how they've had to reorient those. But Imran, really interested to hear your broader perspectives on these issues.
Thanks, Tracy, and it's a pleasure to be here. And you're absolutely right. I think if you'd asked me before the pandemic started and said, look, there's going to be this big global health issue which has science at its heart, is that going to be good or bad for public engagement and public communication of science? I'd have said, well, one of the biggest challenges we've got in public engagement is the demand versus supply problem. That actually often we want to tell people about research and show how research is relevant to them, but we're starting from a place where maybe it isn't, or maybe the assumption is that it's hard to make that relevance clear. And now we're in a situation where their relevance could not be clearer. And this demand for great scientific content and great engagement expertise has arguably never been higher. But in fact, some of the speakers on this panel and lots of people in the audience will know we faced huge challenges around things like the infodemic, around lack of trust. So it's probably not been what I expected. And in large part, as you say, that is due to the fact that the volume of information, the volume of things we need to know has just really outstripped the capacity we have within the research and the public engagement sector to respond. And it has been difficult. So where does that leave us? I've kind of got three things I was mulling over that I wanted to leave the panel and the audience with in terms of how we move forward. The first is, I think, that the infodemic and the pandemic have shown us that we really need to pick our battles, that we can't do everything all the time. We at Wellcome funded a bit of research on misinformation and trust in terms of online content around health. And it was really just a qualitative study to see what are people doing, what are organizations doing to try and combat this problem that we have, particularly online. And we found a sample of 150 different initiatives from around the world, from all continents, that are explicitly trying to address misinformation. And what we found was that the biggest single thing that organizations are trying to do is combat bad content with good content. So they're seeing misleading or deceitful or just poor quality information online. And in response, we're trying to put out better information online. So it's trying to fight fire with fire, trying to myth bust, trying to swamp bad information with good information. And what we found was that the evidence base for that is mixed, that sometimes, for instance, myth busting can do the opposite. It can tell people a poor quality claim out there exists when they had no knowledge of it before. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And relatively underinvested are things like trying to work out best practice, trying to establish better controls. There are increasingly online platforms trying to do things like stop misinformation getting out there at the source. So whether it's WhatsApp or Instagram or Twitter, clearly we're seeing other forms of trying to combat misinformation online. But the emphasis still seems to be on getting other content out there. And I think that should force us to question, are we doing the thing which we think is the most effective? Or are we just doing the thing which is easiest and most visible? And I think we need to take a step back and say, actually, let's figure out what is most needed rather than just what's the easiest thing to do. The second thing is, I think we need to know our audience and recognize that, as we often say in public engagement, there is no homogenous mass of the public. Everyone's different. So for instance, we just published a study at Wellcome, I think last week, showing that in the UK, ethnic minority groups, so Black and ethnic minority groups, are less likely to find information about COVID clear. So white people in the UK, 1%, so kind of over 2 white people in the UK, so the information they received about how to stay safe was clear, where it was only half of people from a non-white background who said information was clear. So clearly this is not a problem with the information, because the information is the same, but it's about how it's being received, who it's being received by, who do people trust to give them the information. So again, if we only focus on the information itself, we're missing signals about how it's being interpreted, who's the conveyor of that information, and who's trusted. And again, we also found that Black and ethnic minority people in the UK were less likely than white people in the UK to trust information about COVID from government sources and from health sources, although interestingly, trust in scientific sources was about the same. So there is cause for hope there. And lastly, Tracy, I wanted to touch upon the question you raised about what is the role of research and what is the role of researchers. And I think it comes back to something that Stefan was saying in his introduction, which is that I think we've got into a bit of a habit in the research sector, and I think we're all probably to blame for this, funders, communicators, journals, of communicating science via press release and saying that science is to be communicated once the paper's done, once the findings are clear, once we've got that handy press release at the end. And what that stops us doing is communicating the messy innards of science and acknowledging, as in fact Laura was just saying, that science is full of blind alleys, full of logical leaps, full of conditional knowledge rather than final knowledge. And if we don't communicate how that happens in real time, then we set ourselves up to pretend that science is about final knowledge and it is about proofs, when we all know that it isn't. And I think if there's one silver lining here. It's that data that Stefan showed, which is that actually when we do communicate the messy side of science, when we do show that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, that doesn't cause people to trust science less. It can in fact cause people to trust science more. So I think the lesson for us as research funders is to encourage our researchers and encourage scientists to be open and be honest. And if there's one thing we know about trust, is that people don't trust just on the basis of a white lab coat or just on the basis of authority. People trust because we hope that scientists or doctors or teachers or parents, that they have our best interests at heart, that it's about motivation, not just about credentials and qualifications. So if we can communicate scientists trying to make sense of this messy world, trying to figure out the COVID problem and trying to do it with the best intentions, I think that's the thing that's most likely to lead to increased levels of trust rather than decreased ones.
Thank you so much, Imran. That's really interesting. It raises even more issues and questions for us to discuss. I think one of the interesting things that perhaps we might want to visit, and I'll certainly be coming back to you on, is this question of you've got science coming through the press offices, as you mentioned. What you've also got is a lot of science coming through the policy platform. And that makes it quite complex. It also makes it perhaps more complex that in this area, what you have is a lot of scientists who are big in advocacy. So public health generally is rather a confused thing from a public point of view, as which is the science and which is the behaviour change, the policy change that you're asking for. And I think that has been a tricky one, perhaps, to think about. Certainly, from Sense About Science's point of view, we have found that a lot of what's out there serves well people who follow current affairs. And what we had was a huge influx of people who generally don't follow current affairs, suddenly following current affairs. A lot of them are stuck at home, you know, obviously doing that. And a lot of our work was involved in helping people to frame questions, because that's actually a really challenging thing. People don't ask questions in ways that invite scientific answers, you know, necessarily. And you often have to unpick right from the kind of phrase of, is this fair, for example, to work out where's the testable science bit in this that you want to look for. So I think that's an interesting challenge that perhaps I didn't see an awful lot of that out there. But I've certainly personally, I would have put that in if I hadn't been listening so hard. I would have put it into the Menti question. But one of the biggest challenges that I found was to try to sort of help people to draw out their underlying question and to pursue it in an active way. So that was, I think, yeah, quite difficult, really quite a challenge for us. Let's move now. This is a good moment, I think, to move to Emma, because Emma Francis from the Karolinska Institute has also been sort of out there trying to engage in a whole range of debates. I think probably has some reflections on what Imran has just said, but particularly thinking about whether the discussion has shifted in the types of questions and issues she's answering with. And I know that Emma's been thinking about the messy innards of science, which is what Imran just mentioned, and communicating how we do science a lot more. So we'll move to Emma, but before I just take a moment to say, please do send your questions and we will weave those into the discussion as quickly as we can. So just put those into your chat box now and we will feed those through as we come to discuss more with the panel. Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. Well, as Tracy said, I'm an epidemiologist, researcher, but I've been working for quite some time with science communication. I've been writing for one of Sweden's largest newspaper, and I've been a regular guest on national TV. And my role during this pandemic has been to explain to the public what's going on and what we know about the virus and about how this virus is spreading. And I think in March and April, I was on national TV almost every evening. So there's been a huge interest. And after being on Swedish television, as you might know, Sweden has gotten a lot of attention because of the policies that we've had here. So I've also tried to explain to an international public what is actually going on in Sweden, because there have also been a lot of misinformation around the Swedish strategy, and that people are walking around in Sweden just as nothing has happened. And I've tried to stay neutral. I've seen that some scientists have become activists during this pandemic. I've tried as much as I can to stay neutral. Not sure that I've always succeeded. But my experience is that there's been a huge interest. I have never experienced something similar before. It can sometimes be very difficult to get people who do not regularly follow the science news to get interested in these questions, but this has not been a problem at all. I've been overwhelmed with the number of questions and the huge interest. People do not only know what an epidemiologist does, they can even pronounce the word, and people want to know what the R number is and what herd immunity means. So the interest is very, very huge, I would say. But there have been some problems as well. And I have colleagues who have done research on, for instance, you might have heard about these T-cell response studies, and they have been very much used by right-wing activists wanting to open society fully, and he has been very disturbed by how his research has been misinterpreted. And I think there's many emotions going on right now, so I think these questions are also being politicized in a way that maybe climate research had been previously. My experience is also that there are many more questions than answers, and people want fast answers, but science, I think, has to take time. And everyone is now following the scientific development in real time, and a lot of studies are being published before going through peer review, and this increases the risk of mistakes being communicated, and some studies have already been retracted. And I think it's important now to get people to understand that much of the science that is being published and communicated through the media must be seen as preliminary knowledge. We shouldn't only communicate about the results, but also about the scientific method to get people to understand how science work, that it's sort of a jigsaw puzzle and that we're putting it together piece by piece, and this has to take time. And there have also been discussions about the experts not agreeing, and I would say that experts agree on a lot of things, but maybe that the issues that they are disagreeing on is also very much being highlighted by the media. So there's some kind of exaggeration in how much the experts disagree. But we have also had loud public debates between scientists in Sweden. Some have been very disrespectful, and I think that overall is bad for the scientific community and our credibility as scientists. So I think it's been a challenge, definitely, also looking forward, how to get people to understand that although it's not absolute truth that we are getting out, we should trust the science and we should trust the scientists. And also getting people to understand that science takes time. And I think now, for instance, when we're starting to talk about a vaccine, and this vaccine from Russia that already was granted, even though there have not been a lot of research on the safety and effectiveness of it. And I think that's very problematic also, because we had this huge problem with vaccine hesitance in the world. And therefore, it's also very important to get people to understand that vaccines are safe and effective, but also that they have to be extensively tested before they are being mass distributed.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was fantastic, and really put forward some big challenges. I think you did a wonderful job, by the way. I really do, and I think you and quite a number of people have kind of been trained in this experience to engage people in very, very different debates. And what I love about it is those debates have been shaped by the people themselves. So quite often the kind of programs that you've been on, the discussion has been led by public questions rather than the kind of thing that Imran was talking about, which is the sort of press release telling people, doing the show and tell about your research. Instead, those discussions have been very responsive to public questions. And I think that's been great for other people to see. I've got a question for all of you, which is that, do you think it was inevitable, or it is inevitable, that as society opens up and people have different views about how we should now live with the virus and so on, and let's be careful with this because, we don't particularly want to assign the scientific view to a particular view of how we should live now, right? I mean, it's legitimate. I think it's important with dealing with conspiracy theories as well to say it's legitimate to have a view that you don't want to do anything about this virus. It's a political policy view. We can have a debate about it in society about whether we want to do that or not. But I think it's there are lots of different views. There are people who are concerned to protect very vulnerable groups a lot more than we are. Rightly so. We've got some people who really do need care. And there are also sort of debates about different measures. But of course, what's happening is the view on the science and what the evidence is, what the risk level is starting to be dictated by our disposition to how we want to manage those risks in society. And rather like the climate change discussion, our willingness to pick out certain bits of evidence or to latch on to things like the T-cell research that Emma mentioned seems to be driven by, what we want to, what kind of society we want to live in. I want to ask you, is that inevitable? Do you think it's inevitable that that initial kind of questioning about what is this virus, how's it going to affect us, that sort of rather open-ended thing, we're going to end up in this place where we have cherry picking and that kind of thing? Is that inevitable, or is it something that we could and should be doing something about? Can we stop it? I'd really like to know what your thoughts are on that. Imran, I'm going to come back to you first, and then to Stefan, and then to Laura, and I'll come back round. I'll come back round you all for a quick minute on that thought. Do you think we're in an inevitable pathway here?
I mean, I never think we're in an inevitable pathway.
Good.
I think what feels hard at the moment is that a lot of the debates around COVID and where we go next feel like they have a lot of inertia. Like, it feels like the political systems, the media systems, which have set our norms around how we discuss COVID, what the content around COVID is, they feel so entrenched. But equally, I think we have to remember that everything about how we are debating society's response to COVID is incredibly new. All of this is mere months old. So as kind of hard as it may seem to think about how do we change the political partisan debate that feels like it's emerging on lockdown versus not lockdown, how do we respond to concerns about things like vaccine nationalism, where some countries feel like the way forward is to protect their own citizens, even though in the long run, the thing we have to do as a society is protect the world's most vulnerable, because that's the only way in which we'll all be safe. All of these norms, which feel like they've sprung up around COVID, are incredibly, incredibly fresh. They're mere weeks and months old. So I think in darker moments, we may feel depressed seeing the news and seeing the way in which people are talking about what we should do. I think we should also take a bit of heart from the fact that it is so new and it is so fresh, and that there should be a chance for us to change that debate and hopefully change it with the evidence that shows that, as Stefan was saying at the beginning, to get out of this, we know that we need to work together and build our response on the research and on the science.
Great, fantastic. Stefan.
Yeah, okay, well, those are big questions, and I'm not sure that we really have a complete answer. But having said that, we do know enough to make some suggestions. And one of the things that I think has been shown over and over again to be fairly effective is to inoculate people against conspiracy theories and misinformation ahead of time. So instead of waiting for some rumor, conspiracy theory, or some myth to emerge, let's get ahead of the game and say up front, oh, there's a pandemic. Guess what? Somebody is going to come up with a conspiracy theory, because people always do. And you can tell it's a conspiracy theory because it's incoherent. All conspiracy theories are, sooner or later, and all the pandemic conspiracy theories are no exception. They're utterly incoherent, they're illogical, they're not based on data. There's a lot of ways in which we can explain why they're false. And if you get to people before they're exposed to that and before they go down the rabbit hole, then they become more resilient to misinformation. So I would argue that that should be a main line of attack. But of course, that's only one. There's lots of other things we can do. And we have to also look at, as Imran was saying, we have a media system that we have to live with. But within that media system, I think we can also work on journalists and communicators and underscore to them how important it is to differentiate between actual evidence and nonsense. And that putting the two on an equal footing by creating a false balance is not doing the public a service. And they're slowly, very slowly beginning to recognize that, but that's a process we have to accelerate, I think. Yeah. And the other thing that I think we have to recognize in all of this is that we're living in an environment that is inherently adversarial. There are some people out there who are not acting in good faith. I can tell you that right now. There's plenty of people out there who want to do harm for political reasons. They may come from outside the European Union. They may be political operatives within the European Union who are instrumentalizing everything relating to COVID now, as the extreme right is doing. Well, we have to recognize that. And we cannot be Boy Scouts going to a machine gun fight with a feather duster. We got to recognize that there's something for people out there who want to do harm. And we must do everything we can, first of all, to meet that, but also to tailor our communication along those lines, and to recognize that not everybody we're talking to actually wants to hear us. They want to turn things we say against us. So we have to plan more carefully in how we reach the vast majority of people who do not belong to that small number of bad faith actors.
Yeah. And of course, when we come out to the bigger questions on COVID, not just those about, is it sort of a escape from a lab or all those kind of things, but we come out to those bigger questions. Of course, what we don't have is some of that confidence that we have in, say, climate change, where we know that remedial action is needed and we know that it's of a certain scale, but we actually don't know what the unintended consequences are of certain interventions on COVID. The long tail thing with younger people is starting to come out now. So there's things that's shifting that. So even, we kind of got to go to that, as you say, not feather duster, but we've got to go to that with a lot of uncertainty still on board. And that's the challenge.
Absolutely. But, for example, what we do know from everything we know about COVID is that the virus responds to behavioral measures. Social distancing and wearing masks appears to be very effective. I would take that now as established scientific knowledge. And I would say, well, it's not going to hurt you to wear a mask when you go to the grocery store. So just do it because it's going to save lives. There are things we can say, and I think we should dig in and have a firm position vis-a-vis that knowledge that is firmly established, acknowledging that there's other stuff, that we don't know yet.
Yeah, fine. Good. Laura. Can you unmute, Laura?
Sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
That was a bit of a rookie error. Sorry for that. I wanted to come back to a point that Imran was making with regards to the point he raised on norms and the fact that these norms are actually very new. This might be slightly controversial in a Euroscience Open Forum session, but of course norms are not new to science, and we hold science up as this sort of on a pedestal as this perfect, completely objective, pure discipline, when in actual fact it's not. And there's so many values that are embedded in the scientific process, and that is not to detract in any way, shape or form from the scientific process. But what we're actually seeing is to enhance trustworthiness. People not only expect scientific excellence, but very importantly, they need to be able to trust the person who's actually talking to them. And very important to that is finding mutual ground based on values. And so actually understanding what people's motivations are and why they're doing what they're doing, and openly stating that, you know, to the point that Imran was talking about earlier about the importance of not just the sort of finely polished press release at the end of a very long process, but talking about the messiness of it all, talking about how we actually got here, the trials, the tribulations, and it's not some remote elitist area, to actually make it connect so much more to the reality of why people are doing these things in the first place. I think that's going to be really important.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, because we were all confronted, whether you were an immunologist or my mum, you know, you were all confronted with the same questions, like, how do we understand this? So at a certain point, we all kind of embarked on that together, Emma. I mean, that there was a joint enterprise there. Is it inevitable, though, that has sort of fractured a bit, that sense of us all setting off on the same journey with different kind of questions to bring to that party? But now things are starting to entrench a bit. People are starting to grab, as you said, your colleague with the T cells research. Do you think that's inevitable, or can we knock that out? Can we get back to that shared endeavour of trying to fill in the picture as best we can?
Well, what I told him, my colleague, the researcher behind the study, because he was very upset actually. He was regretting that he sent out this press release because of how people were using the results of his study. And what I told him was that it's not your responsibility. Some people will be using this research for a certain political purpose. What you can do yourself is to take responsibility in communicating this to the public in an understandable and neutral way. But I think also, I very much agree with Laura that you have to build a trust for scientists and also for the scientific method. And this is something that takes time. So this is this is something that we have to do for a long time period. And I think in these situations, when there is a pandemic, when there is a crisis, then we will know whether we have the trust of the public or not. Because I think it's very difficult to do that within the crisis. I think this is something that we have built up for a long time, hopefully, and we will see the result of it right now. But I think it's very difficult to do during a crisis.
Do you think that you and colleagues have spent a lot more time trying to help people understand the way that you're going about these questions? I mean, vaccines has been mentioned, and we've got a question that's come in on vaccines I'm going to come back to shortly. But do you feel that, you know, trying to explain the process of science and those questions has been perhaps, you know, you've seen gaps there where you make assumptions, but you realise they're not widely held in society?
Definitely, because people are not prioritizing public outreach, and when they do it, it's more like doing some kind of you try to highlight what you have done as a researcher in order to get more funding. So it's not educating people, I would say. It's more highlighting yourself as a researcher and your research. So I think it's also important when we talk about the public outreach and science communication, we shouldn't only talk about ourselves and our own research, but more, what is science? How do we do it? How do people in their daily life use some kind of similar scientific method? And it's not something that is always difficult, and you have to have a high education. It's extending how you as a normal person try to figure out what to do in your daily life. So
Yeah, and I think what we're hearing from the panel, what you're all saying is that I'm really picking up, there are actually different end games here, aren't there? So for some people, the end game is that we have a public that is more science literate. For others, it's that policymakers are able to make decisions that have public benefit. And to understand the implications of those. For others, it's that we have particular outcomes, that we are kept safe from this virus to a certain degree. And I think, Stefan, you kind of more in that sort of domain, which is that we have clear policy goals here that we should be striving towards, and that we'll measure the success if we can achieve those goals without sort of falling prey to, the merchants of doubt and all that kind of thing, and so on. And there are different outcomes. There are other outcomes, I think, that Imran's pointed to, which is, your university gets featured on the front page of a major newspaper, or your research gets profile or funding, and and that sort of that PR type thing. We don't really look at that and say, is that helping anyone? I have to say that the trouble is, when you go down the route of helping people to, say, knock out a conspiracy theory, you don't always end up in the most edifying scientific debate. I mean, I ended up having to point out how much, when you click on a YouTube video for David Icke, how much advertising revenue he gets. I'm afraid that was my best argument, and it's the one that worked. It's not exactly explaining science to anybody. I think I was in that frame that Stefan talked about, which is that, you don't turn up to fight, or turn up to the earthquake with a dustpan and brush. We've got a question. I'm going to, actually, before we come to that, let's have a look at the Menti poll. We've all been talking about what we need more of and what the challenges are. Sissy, can we see what the results are? So what's the best action to improve public engagement during the pandemic? So let's have a look at this. I'm not sure I can follow all of the language on this. Associating citizens in defining actions. I don't really understand what that one means. Support for researchers who take part in the debate. I think that's something that Emma's flagged up, that support might be a bit different. And certainly what Laura was saying about research synthesis, that the kind of support we give researchers might actually need to change. We've got science literacy coming in. I think that's we need to perhaps talk about what we mean by science literacy. Okay, give a voice to the 90% that the media do not follow. Is that the 90% of researchers or the 90% who don't follow the media? I'm not quite sure. Yeah, but it's certainly the case that there are some very high profile debates. So this is interesting. I think everyone on the panel is going to agree better coordination between science policy and so on. Yeah. Great. We're going to come back to a few of these, actually. Please, if you've been somebody who said that thing about the 90%, I would really like to hear more from you. Please put a question in the chat. I'd really like to understand what that means and what you're getting at there. We have a question from Lawrence Marama, who's asked about the vaccine and vaccine hesitancy that's been mentioned by the panel. And so the question is, do we know about how many people would be against a vaccine if one is available? And I wonder what you think about this sort of thing, because I mean, Imran's mentioned the question about myth busting, and I think others have flagged it. Is it right to try and pull out this whole rather fringe, I mean, it is still fringe, I have to say, the extremes pro and anti and all that. Is it right to try and pull this out into some sort of resolution at this point at which the vaccine is hypothetical? Personally, I'll make a confession. I would not say, yes, I'll take the vaccine in a survey. The vaccine, which vaccine do you mean? And I'd like to be seeing the results, please, of those trials. So, and I think other people I speak to in pharmacy and in the pharmaceutical industry and so on about this question are saying the same thing. It's not a radical position to say, actually, let's wait and see what the vaccine offers, and also let's wait and see who best benefits from that, and whether me taking it would actually deny someone who needs the early doses. So I wonder about this. There is a real attempt, I think, to try and kind of foment this pro and anti, but what do we know about this? What should we be doing? Imran, I'm going to come back to you again, because obviously this is right in your up your street.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I think you're right to pick out some of the nuance in it, Tracy. I think I've got two responses. One is that, going back to this comparison with climate change, I think one of the challenges we have in science and in public engagement with science is that it can be very easy to put all of our attention on the most problematic or the most polarizing views. And climate change is a classic example where so much of the communication about climate and climate science seems to be focused on trying to rebut climate denial. And what we know is that the actual proportion of people, particularly in somewhere like Europe, the actual proportion of the population that is actively denying the science of climate change is tiny. And yet much of the content and engagement around it is focused on those people, completely ignoring the kind of 60% or so of people who are somewhere in the middle, who aren't climate activists, who aren't switching to green electricity, are just trying to get on with their lives, raise their kids, go to their job. And we ignore that proportion of the population in the middle because the squeaky wheel gets the most grease, and that's where we put our attention. Yeah. And I worry sometimes that we're doing the same thing with the broader vaccine debate, but potentially also with the COVID vaccine debate. And the second thing to say is that you're completely right, that actually we are so far ahead of the science right now that actually we don't know what question we're asking, and it's an entirely reasonable response to not be sure as of yet. And in fact, I think the bigger issue with the vaccine that we should be putting our attention on is not necessarily the one around uptake and confidence, but the one around access. You know, it's going to be a long time before we've got enough vaccine doses, hopefully if we can get one, that can mass populate an entire nation or the entire world. What we're going to have to do is face really hard choices, like, do we vaccinate frontline healthcare workers first, or do we vaccinate elderly vulnerable populations first? Yeah. And actually what would be more useful now is having that debate with the public, being honest about the fact that we may get a vaccine that's only 60% effective rather than the 95% efficacy that people might expect from something like MMR. And really getting the nuance of the debate. And again, going back to this idea that we have to communicate the complexity and the uncertainty if we want to get to a place where the public understands and is comfortable with that complexity and uncertainty.
Yeah. Right. Stefan, I'm going to have to keep everyone really short now because I've got more questions coming in and I want to just squeeze in a lot of discussion. Stefan, I just want to ask you about this, sort of taking it on a little bit further. Is it right? I mean, in your view, is it right to try and pull this discussion out, or you know, should we just let it unfold, or should we try and give voice to those more voiceless people in the discussion? I'm going to give you 30 seconds on this because I know you'll be tired.
Yeah, okay, 30 seconds. Well, in general, as I said earlier, I think inoculation is a good thing. Talking about issues ahead of time, setting the framing, providing scientific information in advance is a good thing. So I would say, yes, we should do that, whatever the question. However, I also totally agree that right now, worrying about survey data relating to a hypothetical non-existent vaccination is misplaced. We know that there is vaccine hesitancy in most countries. We also know that, fortunately, it is moderately small in many countries. And moreover, we know what really makes a difference to uptake is how easy and affordable vaccinations are and how easy they are to get. So I'm with Imran on that entirely. You know, we should worry about making it accessible. We should talk about how we get it out there. Once it's there, I don't worry. Personally, I don't worry about uptake.
Right. And it will be down to the trade-offs of the time. Okay. But while I got you though, I've got another question here. And again, I'm just going to give you even shorter time. Preparedness. You know, there is also a feeling that we could have prepared populations in advance much more for these discussions and these issues, because it's not the first public health crisis. We've had SARS, we've had Ebola. There are places where, it feels like the public is feeling a bit like this has been taken by surprise. Is there therefore something that's been going on behind the scenes that we haven't had shared with us? So that kind of feeling that it's coming out now that 3 years ago that this country and that country did a simulation, but nothing was done with the results of it, caught us unprepared. There is that feeling, isn't there, of like more was known, could have been shared. Is that not helping us here?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, I'm sure mistakes were made. There's no question about it. Whether we could have been prepared better and could have talked to the public better, to my mind, is a slightly different question, because one of the problems has been for years that scientists and experts have been denigrated in public discourse. There was this, this isn't coincidental that people say we've had enough of experts. Not at all. That is inherent in populist politics. And we have been confronted with a wave of populism that is inherently anti-scientific, anti-expertise, anti-evidence. I mean, that's what it is.
Right,
So,
but it also touches on what was said by Imran earlier, which is that the demand has just shifted. So perhaps we tried to have that discussion in the past. It would have been a very forceful debate, and now actually it's a demand-led debate. Laura, on this question.
Now, I think the data I showed earlier today suggests that people have started listening again to experts.
Yeah, differently.
And interestingly, populist parties in
Right.
Europe, at least in many countries, have lost a lot of support through the COVID pandemic. Because people notice, oh, well, just yelling about refugees doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah. A basic issue of competence. Laura, can I come to you on this question?
Sure. I mean, there's tremendous amounts of skill across all of the member states if we're looking at this from a European perspective, and there's a lot of knowledge and know-how with regards to preparedness, and that is indeed, is for sure definitely being shared on a regular basis. If you look at the work of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, and then the international links we have with the likes of WHO. So there's certainly been lots of at the interinstitutional level. There's been lots of shared experience that has obviously during crisis times has increased, dramatically.
Thank you. Emma, there's been a question. I'm going to come up to the results of the Menti poll in a minute because we've just got 2 minutes left. There's been a question I just want to throw to you, which is that someone's raised local media in the discussion. And is it the case that a lot of the effort has focused on certain channels that only get to certain people? I mean, do you feel that there's perhaps more to be done in looking forward to what we need to do with public engagement and outreach, that actually there are other kinds of channels we should be serving?
Media channels,
places where people are asking these questions. Maybe it's not that everybody's reading the national newspaper of record in every country.
Well, me myself, I'm very active in social media, and I think this is definitely a good channel for when you want to reach out to younger people. So I think it's important, and also a lot of the disinformation are being spread in these channels. So therefore, I think it's very good to be on these platforms. Then, of course, when we have the physical distancing problems, we can't really be out in the streets communicating our message. But I definitely think it's good to be on social media.
Great. And also, I mean, local newspapers and that kind of thing, regional newspapers. I know people who have been out sort of dealing with sushi makers news in Tokyo, because making sushi with your hands is an issue. I mean, there's interesting outlets for researchers in all sorts of places. Let's go to that Menti poll to finish up and give the last word to our audience. So I want to first thank our fantastic panel and thank you so much for your thoughts. I think there's a lot that you raised that would deserve a session all of its own. And so I would invite other people who are in the audience to look at some other things in the ESOF programme, because there are opportunities for us all to meet again and to take some of those discussions forward, uncertainties featuring and so on. But I first want to say thank you enormously to the rich contribution of Stefan and Imran and Emma and Laura. It was absolutely brilliant. Let's have a look at what you've been saying on that Menti poll. Are you going to share that with us, Susie? Okay, we're not seeing that. I was seeing that there was actually quite a lot going on with, this is answers now to the question. Susie, are we getting this Menti poll? Here we go. Okay, so will public engagement change? Yes, become easier. Okay, there are not many people who answered that. Can we go back to the previous question and have a look at what it was that people were saying about those, what we need more of? Is that possible to do? We can have a last look. Okay. I've given Susie a really big problem right in the last minute. We'll share those results from Menti. If you're actually on Menti, you can see them coming up, and you should find they're still being added to. But please do have a look. Let's support each other. in developing this discussion, and let's share ideas about what we can do next, because we do need to shape a new agenda. And I'm really delighted to thank you, everyone who's put this together, including the group outlined by Cici at the beginning. Thank you so much for creating this platform and this opportunity. Goodbye.